I'm Donna Vitale. I want to thank everybody for joining us again this week. If you've been on before, and if you haven't been on before, welcome to the episode 3 of the 2020 Rogers Park West Ridge Historic House Walk. I'll be your host, and once again, before we start, I want to thank everybody for all the support that you've been showing this year. We've had a steady stream of new members and membership renewals and donations and new volunteers, traffic to our website. It's really been inspiring, and we're looking forward to coming up with more and better programs and activities in the months ahead as the situation gets a little clearer, I hope. As many of you know, the annual House Walk is one of the events that funds all of our other activities. So if you are able in these difficult times, please support us in whatever way that works for you. You can just make a donation, you can become a member or renew your membership, buy our books, or ask for a property history quest report on your own home. There's links to all of those things, or will be, in the chat, and you can go to our website anytime to show support, see what's coming on the calendar, and check out other resources. That being said, before we get started with the program, I want to acknowledge the volunteer members of the society that are making our programs possible, especially the members of the Property History Quest research team. They're the ones who are doing the research that turns up the stories of the houses that we've been talking about on the tour. We can always use more help. So if anybody's intrigued by the idea of getting into doing some real historic research, please fill out a volunteer form on our website and indicate you're interested in working with the collection or writing history articles, and we'll be in touch with more details about what's involved. We've had a couple of recent new volunteers that I have to get oriented next week, and we'd be happy to have more people join us. I also want to again introduce the virtual house tour team. Erin McNeil, our events coordinator, who is handling all the Zoom details for the meeting. So Erin, can you unmute yourself and say hello? Where are you?
Hi, everybody. Yes, sorry, I was having some technical difficulties at the beginning. But hi, it's great to meet those of you that I haven't had a chance to meet in person yet. And I will be manning the the Rogers Park West Ridge Historical Society account today. So if you do have any technical issues or any questions today, feel free to chat me there, and I'll do my best to help you. So I hope you enjoy the presentation today.
Thank you. And we've already been I've already been chatting with Sarah Fiola. So Sarah, say hello.
Hi, everybody. So Donna's going to present the information in sort of a slideshow format. If you have questions, enter them in the chat. I'm going to collect all the questions and save them until the end of the presentation and the video, and we'll get to them all at once. So don't just jump in while Donna's talking. Just put it in the chat. You can either just put it directly into the chat or message Sarah directly.
Let's get started. Before we do, I want to acknowledge our homeowner hosts for today. I think they're online. They had registered. Oh yeah, there I see Dan. Dan Berger and his partner Scott Wenthy, who are with us. And Dan, if you don't mind, if you have questions for you, we'll direct them to you during the question period. So here we go. Let's get started. I have to share the screen again. Here we are. I want to start our story 10 years before the home was built in 1912. By then, Rogers Park had been part of the city of Chicago for 19 years, except for a small chunk of territory known as Germania. It's what we now call the North of Howard area, which got its name from early settlers from Germany. The home we're going to be talking about is located right here on between Rogers and Jonquil Terrace on Sheridan Road, just one block off Eastlake Terrace, which of course bounds on the lakefront. Like the rest of Rogers Park, Germania was part of Evanston Township originally before it was part of the city. But when the village of Rogers Park was established in 1878, Germania was not included. That may have been because this land was never owned by Philip Rogers, and it was his estate that made up most of the territory of the village of Rogers Park, which of course was incorporated by his son-in-law and heir, Patrick Toohey. So Toohey may have just not included this land because he didn't own it and didn't care about it. I'm not exactly sure why. Germania remained then under the jurisdiction of Evanston Township. The residents had addresses served by the Evanston Post Office. The population was very small, and then as today, the shoreline over here was frequently battered by heavy storms, and this whole area flooded a lot as it's doing today, because there were no buildings on Eastlake Terrace at that point, as there are now, to absorb some of the water. So even after the population started growing in around 1900, Germania was really a no man's land. It had almost none of the services that residents of both Evanston and Chicago were coming to expect, like police and street lights and fire and all of those details. By 1912, the Germania residents had had enough. They began with complaints about their post office, which wouldn't even deliver mail to them. They had to go 2 miles to downtown Evanston to pick up their mail at the post office. And soon these protests turned into a full campaign for separation from Evanston and annexation to Chicago. Those were the days of very colorful politicians, and in response to that request to be part of Chicago, one Evanston alderman said, "Let Chicago have them." He said, "Take them. They've pestered us for lights and policemen and firemen and schools and all sorts of things. We gave them 2 street lamps and a cop, and they still ain't satisfied. Let Chicago have them." So it took a couple of years, but by 1914, the Illinois legislature separated Germania from Evanston, and in 1915, Germania became part of the city of Chicago and the community of Rogers Park. So one of the things that happened after annexation was that annexation spurred development. In fact, one of the men who was behind the separation campaign was a developer, Charles Ferguson, who was a local businessman, saw opportunity in all the open land in Germania, so he bought up a lot of the property. He became a major developer of Howard Street as a commercial area. This is his announced plan from 1916 for the Howard Theater building, which still is there on Howard Street. And as you can see, it's quite a magnificent structure. He also created a residential subdivision called Ferguson's Birchwood Addition to Rogers Park that included our own home site that we're talking about, and also his own home of many years, which was around the corner on Juneway Terrace, the furthest north street of the city of Chicago. In 1916, shortly after the annexation, he sold the Sheridan Road lot to Mrs. Lillian Schulz. And in 1922, a building permit was issued. The Schulzes, Mrs. Schulz and her husband, built this home at an estimated cost of $13,000. The permit doesn't tell us much of anything else about the house, such as the name of the architect, but it does show that the home was a little bit larger than the typical Chicago bungalows that were starting to be popular at that time, but it has very similar features. The pitched attic roof here and the horizontal windows and the side entrance are all pretty typical of a classic Chicago bungalow. I think it must have been done by an architect who was starting to experiment with the bungalow form, but we don't know who that was. So when we looked up Lillian Schulz, we learned that she had married Justus Schulz in 1908. She was then a 32-year-old widow with an 11-year-old son, and Justus was 30 years old. He himself was the son of Prussian or German immigrants and was born in Chicago, so they must have fit right into the neighborhood. Justus had a long career as an insurance man. He worked for most of his life for the Illinois Insurance Company, joined the company in the 1890s, and he stayed with it until the 1930s when it collapsed due to financial problems brought on by the Depression. One short side note, Illinois Life was founded by James W. Stevens, whose family was involved in a lot of other Chicago businesses. Some people may remember the Charles A. Stevens retail stores. They were founded by the four Stevens brothers, including James, before the Civil War. Charles was the oldest, so he got his name on the company, and he ran the company, and eventually the other brothers all branched off into other businesses. So James Stevens started Illinois Life, and in addition, he also built and operated 2 luxury hotels in downtown Chicago, very large ones, the LaSalle Hotel and the Stevens, which is now known as the Chicago Hilton and Towers. By 1920 or so, one of James's sons ran the insurance business, R.W. Stevens, who is the president shown on this ad, and the other ran the hotel business. Just another short bit of trivia. James Stevens was the grandfather of the late Supreme Court Justice John Paul Stevens, whose father managed the hotel business. We don't know much about Justus, but from what we were able to find, he must have been kind of an outgoing man, always selling. He was a true salesman. By 1930, he had become the district manager for Illinois Life. But when the company and the rest of the Stevens family businesses collapsed, he had to join another company back again as a salesman, and he remained one until he died in 1944, leaving Lillian a widow for the second time. 2 fun things we found were the 2 occasions that Justus took part in man on the street interviews, which were a regular feature in the Chicago Tribune. In 1923, he was asked whether the fines for speeding for cars, which were just coming into popular use at that time, should be abolished and speeders sent to jail instead, which must have been a pressing issue of the day. He answered with a lot of verbiage, but short answer was, I would say yes if I was sure I would never get caught. But as a driver myself, I'll slow down and say no. And then in 1942, he was again intercepted by the inquiring camera girl from the Tribune and asked the question, what favor to a friend or stranger ever paid you dividends? Here's how he answered, which gives us a little of perhaps his sales experience. It's not a habit of mine and not at all like me to say good night and God bless to anyone. But one night I met an insurance customer who just prompted me to say that to him. The next week, he phoned and bought a $200,000 policy. A friend of his later told me it was because of what I had said when I left his home. So Justus may have learned another sales technique. Heaven knows by 1942 he needed it, because during the Depression, times were tough for him and his family. We'll talk about him in a minute, but first I want to talk a little bit about Lillian, who was basically a homeowner, gardener, volunteer, very active in the community. Justus and Lillian had no children of their own, but Lillian was a neighborhood person who did a lot around the community as she raised her son, Frederick, and especially after he grew up. He graduated from Northwestern, he married, he began a career as a salesman in the automotive industry himself. And so Lillian was a homemaker trying to keep herself busy. She's an avid gardener, which is something she has in common with our current homeowners, and was recognized for her garden in contests sponsored by the Chicago Tribune. We found this article in the Tribune from 1932, where she's shown tending an Easter lily. This is the flower. You can barely make it out in this very bad scan. That was still blooming in November. So it must have been a very warm fall that year, but she was clearly in touch with the Tribune for her gardening exploits. She also was active in the Rogers Park Women's Club, which was an important organization in the neighborhood during the 20s and 30s and 40s. During World War II, she was recognized for the work she did through the Women's Club for the Red Cross and the war effort. This article talks about her doing a total of 4,683 hours of sewing for the Red Cross at the Women's Club. For people who started out the COVID pandemic making masks, can you imagine doing that for 2 years for 4,000 hours? Just kind of boggles my mind. But she remained active in the Women's Club for most of the rest of her life, even after Justus died in 1944. And she appears in various social notes during that time period. She died in 1961. I told you that depression was kind of a hard time for the Schulzes. And let's just take a look at this. I show it because it points out the effects of the depression on not just this home and this family, but really it's very typical of what happened in the whole neighborhood. First, we look at the census for 1930, just as the depression was getting underway. It's only 8 years after the home was built for $13,000. This census asked what the value of your home was, and we see Justus and Lillian Schulz there. They owned it, and they valued the house at $25,000. That would include the land, but that's still a substantial increase from the $13,000 construction price from just 8 years before. As the 20s roared, the value of the house increased. But let's look at 10 years later. In 1940, Justus and Lillian were still there. They were in their 60s by then. They put the value of their house in 1940 at $10,000. Just think about that, living through a 10-year period when your property lost 60% of its value. It just kind of makes me shudder. That was also the 10-year period during which Julius lost his job. And the census shows us that he was no longer a district manager as he had been in 1930, but was now just back being an insurance salesman. The census that year asked how many weeks you had worked in 1939. Justus had worked 52 weeks, the whole year. He only earned $900. I have seen census reports from 1939 where the live-in servants and housekeepers of people in the neighborhood had earned $500 or $600 in 1939. So Justus, trying to support himself and Lillian in this beautiful house, on that amount of money was probably pretty hard. The decline in the value of the property came in spite of the fact that by 1937, the property included a large garage structure that had been built sometime after the permit was issued. The permit says nothing about building garages on the property. But by 1937, this fire insurance map shows that there were 4 stalls of a garage here facing the west, the alley that bordered the property on the west, 5 stalls that faced the alley that came on the south end of the property, and then this one that was actually facing a driveway that goes out onto Sheridan Road and is still used today as a garage. We'll find out more about what happened to these garage buildings as we see the video tour. But in 1930s, Justus or Frederick, or maybe both of them, were selling used automobiles out of these garages. Here's one, a 1934 Buick, used for 1,000 miles. You can get it for $1,000.75. Just a little interesting thing. The garages were something we see in other properties in the neighborhood. And we think people who had room on their land were building extra garages and then renting them to their neighbors as a way to generate extra income. So when Lillian died in 1961, her son Fred inherited the house, but he died only 6 months later. And in 1963, his widow sold the property. It passed then through 3 more owners for the next several years until in 1992, it was purchased by Dr. Daniel Berger. Let's look at Daniel Berger. He has lived there for 28 years, so his story is an important part of the history of the house. Dan was born in Brooklyn, and he came to Chicago to attend medical school. After a residency in St. Joseph Hospital, he began practicing medicine. He was first in a practice in Andersonville, and now he has a clinic called the North Star Healthcare on Sheffield Avenue. From the early days of his practice, Dr. Berger has been a pioneer in the treatment of HIV-positive patients, and his clinic has become the largest HIV/AIDS treatment and research center in the Chicago area. He's nationally recognized as a leader in this field. He's also an important collector of contemporary art, specializing in works by African American and queer artists. He founded Iceberg Projects in 2010 and remodeled those 9 garage stalls on the property into a not-for-profit gallery that serves as a place for artists and guest curators to develop their projects. Dan serves on the board of governors of the Art Institute and was recognized as one of the most influential people in Chicago's art community by New City Art in 2015. And in 2019, he was named to that organization's Art Hall of Fame. Questions, comments, anybody? Sarah?
There was a question about, do you know why Evanston would want to give up so much land?
At the time, they just didn't think it was worth much. We know that the whole lakefront in those days before it was developed, I mean, the picture we've got here is of the birch forest. It was basically swamp and birch trees. There wasn't much there. It wasn't particularly good for farming. It flooded. I mean, we're seeing that again now, but I found quotes from Charles Ferguson that said people just thought it was a wasteland and nobody much cared about this particular part of the city. It also was cut off from Evanston by Calvary Cemetery, which is immediately to the north of Germania, and by the train tracks, which are now the CTAL tracks that go on the west edge of Germania. So there was no affinity or connection to Evanston with this property. It was much more closely related to Rogers Park, but as I said before, Patrick Toohey didn't own it, so he probably didn't care if it was included in the village or not. That's how it became kind of a no man's land, sort of an orphan territory that nobody particularly wanted.
Or it sounds like could get to very easily.
Or they could get to it from the south, from Rogers Park pretty easily. But, you know, remember also in those days, one of the big issues was the property was fundamentally undeveloped. So if you were the city, any city, and took on a big plot of land like that, you had to provide things like the Evanston alderman didn't want to provide: streets, street lights, sewers, sidewalks, water service, fire service, police protection, postal service. All of that stuff was not existing and was the responsibility of the cities to start paying for, and the taxpayers of the city. So taxpayers of Evanston didn't want to spend any money on this property that they couldn't even get to very easily. And the city of Chicago just probably didn't even think that it was interested in being part of them until the residents started agitating for annexation.
Because of the swampland nature of the area, were the houses built on a higher ground?
Well, that's an interesting question. This house and the other houses on the same block that are still there, there's one that must have been really nice that has been destroyed. But there are, I think, 3 other houses on this block between Rogers and Jonquil Terrace are all sort of raised up above the street level. And I suspect that might have been to alleviate flooding or to compensate for flooding. Sheridan Road was put in several years before these houses were developed. So the street was there, but I don't think there was much across the street and all the way to East Lake Terrace until about the 1920s. So I'm not exactly sure why that property was raised. If anybody out there knows, let us know, because it's an interesting question.
The backyard looked really big, and then you had mentioned that there were 2 like garage type buildings on the property. Are the lots extra large in that part of Rogers Park, or?
I was going to look that up and I forgot, but yes, the typical lot in Rogers Park is 25 feet across, and I think it's 125 feet deep. And it looks to me, from looking at these aerial maps, that this property is a deeper, much more property in the back. That's a big backyard. And so I suspect it, for whatever reason, the way it was subdivided, the way Charles Ferguson thought a subdivision ought to be made, or for maybe other practical reasons, that these lots are larger than the ordinary Chicago city block. Because, for instance, in the house we were in last week, or the house that I lived in that was very similar to a 2-flat, a 2-flat. Once you put a 2-car garage in the backyard, there wasn't much room for any other yard. And I think that's true in most of the neighborhood. But here, that yard is so deep that there was plenty of room for all these garage structures.
Somebody mentioned that they were interested in the old stables and the use of horses in Chicago. When did most people switch from horses to cars?
Well, I think it probably depended on the person's level of income, the richer people, and this area was a pretty wealthy area in the early part of the 1900s up until through the 20s, really. It was the Depression that brought it kind of down. But this area, people had cars by then. When Sheridan Road was built, which was in the, 1890 maybe, something like that, that was an important factor, that there was a road that you could drive down Sheridan Road, and people used to go do car caravan things where a bunch of people would all get in their little roadsters, or the cars with the open cars with the steering wheel and the seats and the back rumble seat kind of thing, and go take day trips places. So the wealthier people had cars in the early part of the 20th century, and then it wasn't until Henry Ford started making things like Model Ts that were affordable that ordinary people had cars. But the Schulzes had cars. They were pretty well off until they weren't.
Well, and it's curious too, as Lillian's son, went to Northwestern University, became an auto salesman or an executive. Could that have been the reason that there was an extensive garage system and cars being sold out of there?
It's possible. I think Frederick must have had something to do with those cars. I mean, Justus was a salesman, I think, probably through and through, and he probably passed that trait down to Frederick. But I have a feeling that the cars were probably Frederick's thing. It just seems kind of far away from what Justus otherwise seemed interested in. But who knows, we just found a lot of ads, and they weren't all the time. You didn't see 20, 30 ads a year from those people, from this garage sales, but we saw ads pretty steadily through this time period of cars for sale at this address. It's one of the things about doing this research. The newspapers were so commonly publishing people's addresses for almost any reason that when you search for an address in a newspaper archive, you never know what you're going to come up with. You're going to get all kinds of interesting stuff. And the car ads were one of the things that came for this one.
Somebody asked if the cemetery boundary is the same as it is now, Calvary.
I believe so, yes. And the cemetery was there long before the subdivision was made. So I think that, yes, the boundary of the cemetery is now the Chicago city limits, and that was where Germania started, was south of the cemetery.
Somebody is asking, is it permissible to drive by the house? And I just want to say that for more information on the Iceberg Gallery, there is a website for Iceberg Gallery.
Yes, although, Dan, are you there? Is it operative at the moment, or have you shut it down for some reason? I had trouble getting to it earlier.
The website is icebergchicago.com. Due to the COVID-19 pandemic, the gallery is temporarily closed, but it is opened. I do some classes for the School of the Art Institute in there, talking about curatorial practice and topics such as that. But otherwise, it's generally closed, and hoping that in the near future it will reopen again once this is all past us.
When you get that going again, let us know, and we'll send out a notice to our file, let people know that it's there. I think it's kind of a not very visible but really important thing in the community that people should kind of be aware of, at least.
Sure thing.
More questions, Sarah?
Donna, the borders you showed at first map, that was just the neighborhood borders, wasn't it? Because Chicago went up Rogers Avenue. I've seen where.
Oh yeah,
Yeah.
that first map was clipped. No, actually, the city limit of Chicago at first was at Birchwood. It was Birchwood.
It was? Okay.
Yeah. Mhm.
So when did it go to Howard apart from Germania?
1915, when Germania was.
No, it was Howard, west of the tracks.
Well, that may be true. That may have been part of Patrick Toohey's original designation. There were
And
two
I've seen-
annexations. One was in 1893, and the other was Germania in 1915.
Yeah.
So one or the other of those times happened.
Yeah, I've seen what is it? The fire maps. They show Rogers as the border of Evanston, of the city. That was the city limits. Was Rogers? Maybe it went down to Birchwood, but
Right.
it was
Yeah.
Rogers. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
People who don't know, that's Rob Case, our photo archivist.
I've got the pictures of that. You talk about that motor trip. That was the Birchwood Country Club. Went down to
Yes.
Starved Rock. It's a
Yeah.
great series of photos.
Beautiful photographs from that.
Yeah.
And people did that all the time. One of the other houses we researched, we found an article about people from Rogers Park taking a caravan out to a horse show in Wheaton in, I think, about 1912 with their cars.
Hmm.
In that same kind of way, car caravan. And then I think they even stayed the night because Wheaton was so far away.
Yeah. Thanks.
So no, there's actually no more questions.
No more questions? Okay, well then we'll just wrap up with the last two stops on our virtual tour. Next week we go to a home that was built around 1900 on Greenleaf near Greenview. It's got a really interesting history and it's a beautiful home. In 2 weeks, we will be having our final episode at the Park Gables Apartments, which is Estes Avenue at Indian Boundary Park. Park Gables was built in 1928. They are cooperative apartments, and they actually were the first co-op apartment building to be certified as an official sound co-op investment. So you'll learn more about that in 2 weeks. You have to register separately for each one. So if you haven't registered yet for those two, please go to our website and do so, assuming you want to see them. We are posting links to episodes 1 and 2 on our website. Episode 1 is up. Episode 2 will be up tomorrow. Dan has requested that we not post this one, and so we won't, but the other 2 episodes will also be posted. So if you miss anything, you can always go back to our website and watch them later. And just to finally wrap up, we'll be posting a few more coming events soon. So while you're at our website, look at that. And a reminder, we need your support while you're at our website. You can do any of these things to help us out. Join, renew your membership, make a donation, buy our books. We have a few of our cookbooks still left. We got a lot of books on the neighborhood history. And you can find out more about the Property History Quest, which is our newest service, where we do this kind of in-depth research on people's homes. And Dan commissioned one of those reports, and that's how we got into studying this beautiful property. So with that, I'll say goodbye, stop sharing the screen, and thank you all for coming.